Sarah Mitchell stood before the mirror in the employee bathroom of Le Jardin, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, adjusting her pristine white apron and checking her appearance one last time. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed countless nights of overtime, but she expertly concealed them with another layer of concealer. The restaurant's crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains might fool the customers, but the staff knew the truth about what went on behind those perfectly polished brass doors. 5 minutes until service. The sharp voice of Marcus, the floor manager, echoed through the hallway. Sarah took a deep breath, plastered on her practiced smile, and stepped out into the controlled chaos of the pre-dinner rush. Le Jardin catered to New York's elite, hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and international business people who thought nothing of dropping thousands of dollars on a single meal. The pressure to provide perfect service was relentless, and one mistake could mean the difference between keeping your job and joining the city's unemployed masses. Tonight was particularly special, or rather particularly stressful. Hassan Khalil, the enigmatic CEO of global enterprises, had reserved the entire VIP section for a business dinner. His reputation preceded him, demanding, meticulous, and notorious for making or breaking careers of service staff with a single word to management. "Sarah, you're taking Mr. Khalil's table," Marcus announced, his voice tight with anxiety. "Don't screw this up." The last 3 restaurants he visited fired their entire wait staff after his complaints. Her stomach dropped, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "Understood, Marcus, I'll handle it." The evening began smoothly enough. Sarah navigated the complex choreography of fine dining service with practiced ease, anticipating needs before they arose and maintaining the perfect balance between attentiveness and discretion. Mr. Khalil sat at the head of the table, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing every eye in the room. He barely acknowledged her existence as she presented each course, which was actually preferable to the condescending attention some wealthy patrons showed. Everything changed when she served the main course, a perfectly seared Wagyu beef with truffle reduction. As she placed the plate before Mr. Khalil, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. The sudden movement caused a single drop of sauce to splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. "This is lukewarm," he stated, his voice cutting through the ambient restaurant noise like a knife. The other diners at his table froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. "I apologize, sir. I'll have the kitchen prepare a fresh plate immediately," Sarah responded, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. "No." Mr. Khalil's voice grew louder, drawing attention from nearby tables. "This is unacceptable. I specifically requested everything to be served at the proper temperature. Do you have any idea how much this meal costs?" Sarah felt her cheeks burning as he continued his tirade. Years of experience had taught her to weather such storms with dignity, but something about his tone, the casual cruelty in his eyes, made this different. "Sir, I assure you—" "I don't want your assurances," he interrupted. "I want competent service. Marcus," his voice boomed across the restaurant, "is this the best your establishment can offer?" Marcus materialized at the table, his face ashen. "Mr. Khalil, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please allow me to comp your entire meal this evening." "The meal?" Mr. Khalil scoffed. "The meal is irrelevant. What I want is accountability. This level of service is beneath my standards and beneath Le Jardin's reputation." Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her professional mask cracking under the weight of humiliation. She watched as Marcus's expression shifted from apologetic to calculated. In that moment, she knew what was coming. "Sarah, please gather your things and leave the premises immediately. Your services are no longer required at Le Jardin." The words hit her like a physical blow. 5 years of dedicated service, countless double shifts, all the time she'd covered for co-workers or stayed late to help with special events. None of it mattered. All wiped away because one powerful man's soup wasn't hot enough. She removed her apron with trembling hands, but held her head high as she walked through the dining room. The other patrons averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their plates or smartphones. Only one person, an elderly woman at a corner table, met her gaze with a look of sympathy. In the locker room, Sarah changed out of her uniform for the last time. Her mind raced with practical concerns. Rent was due next week, her savings were minimal, and New York's restaurant scene was notoriously cliquish. Word of tonight's incident would spread quickly. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the city's endless possibilities suddenly felt overwhelming rather than exciting. The bright lights of Manhattan sparkled above her, indifferent to her plight. She had come to New York with dreams of making it big, of proving herself in the city that never sleeps. Now standing on the sidewalk with a cardboard box containing 5 years of her life, those dreams seemed further away than ever. But something inside Sarah refused to be broken. Maybe this was the push she needed to pursue something different, something more meaningful. She just had to figure out what that something was. The following weeks tested Sarah's resilience in ways she never imagined. Her phone remained silent, despite countless applications submitted to restaurants across the city. It seemed Mr. Khalil's influence reached further than she'd anticipated. Or perhaps the restaurant industry was smaller than she'd realized. Each rejection email felt like another brick in a wall being built between her and her future. Her tiny studio apartment in Queens, once a symbol of independence, now felt like it was closing in on her. The calendar on her wall mockingly displayed upcoming bill due dates, and her savings account dwindled with each passing day. The city that had once held so much promise now seemed determined to push her out. One particularly challenging morning, after another rejection email landed in her inbox, Sarah decided to clear her head with a walk. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of coffee and pretzels from nearby vendors, reminding her of simpler times when she first arrived in New York, full of hope and ambition. Her wandering feet carried her to the entrance of Metropolitan Hospital Center. A bright yellow flyer caught her eye. Healthcare assistance needed, no experience required, training provided. Sarah stopped, reading the notice twice. It wasn't restaurant work, but something about it called to her. Inside, the hospital bustled with activity, but differently from the controlled chaos of Le Jardin. Here, the energy felt purposeful, directed toward helping others rather than catering to egos. At the HR office, she met Linda Martinez, the nursing supervisor, a woman whose warm smile contrasted sharply with her no-nonsense demeanor. "So, no healthcare experience?" Linda asked, reviewing Sarah's resume. "No, ma'am. I've spent the last 5 years in food service, but I'm a quick learner and good with people." Linda studied her thoughtfully. "You know, sometimes our best caregivers come from unexpected backgrounds. Restaurant work requires attention to detail, multitasking, and dealing with difficult people, all valuable skills in healthcare." Sarah leaned forward, hope flickering in her chest for the first time in weeks. "I'm willing to work hard and learn whatever I need to." "The pay isn't great, especially during training," Linda warned, "and the hours can be challenging." "I'm used to long hours and demanding work," Sarah replied with a small smile. "And honestly, I'm looking for something more meaningful than serving overpriced meals to people who don't appreciate them." Linda's expression softened. "There's a story there, isn't there?" Sarah hesitated, then shared an abbreviated version of her experience at Le Jardin. To her surprise, Linda didn't seem put off by the story of her dismissal. "Well, their loss might be our gain. We need people who can keep their composure under pressure and treat everyone with dignity, regardless of how they behave." Linda stamped several forms and handed them to Sarah. "Training starts Monday at 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." The next few weeks passed in a blur of training sessions, medical terminology, and hands-on practice. Sarah absorbed everything she could, staying late to study procedures and asking countless questions. The work was challenging in ways she'd never experienced before, but it felt right. Her first real test came when she was assigned to Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, an elderly patient recovering from hip surgery. Mrs. Thompson was known among the staff for being particular about her care and resistant to new faces. "I don't want any new people," Mrs. Thompson declared when Sarah entered her room. "Where's Nancy? She knows how I like things done." Instead of retreating, Sarah drew on her years of experience handling difficult customers. "Nancy's on break, Mrs. Thompson, but she's told me exactly how you prefer everything. Would you like to guide me through your routine to make sure I get it right?" The simple act of giving Mrs. Thompson control over the situation changed everything. As they worked together, the elderly woman began sharing stories about her life. Her career as a dance instructor, her travels around the world, the love story with her late husband. Sarah found herself genuinely interested, asking questions and sharing bits of her own story in return. By the end of her shift, Mrs. Thompson had warmed up considerably. "You're different from the others," she observed. "There's a gentleness in your hands, but strength too, and you actually listen. Not everyone was as easily won over." Nurse Rebecca Carter, a veteran staff member with 20 years of experience, watched Sarah's interactions with poorly concealed skepticism. "This isn't a restaurant," she remarked coldly one day. "These people aren't customers you can charm," with a pretty smile. "They're patients who need real care." The comment stung, but Sarah refused to let it deter her. Instead, she channeled her energy into proving herself through actions rather than words. She stayed late to help with difficult cases, volunteered for the less desirable tasks, and continued to build genuine connections with her patients. One quiet afternoon, while helping Mrs. Thompson with her physical therapy exercises, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The person staring back at her looked different from the polished server who had stood in Le Jardin's bathroom mirror just weeks ago. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face free of makeup, but her eyes held a new kind of confidence. For the first time since leaving the restaurant industry, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The emergency department erupted into chaos as the ambulance sirens pierced the quiet of the night shift. Sarah had just finished, helping Mrs. Thompson settle in for the evening when the code alert echoed through the hospital corridors. Though she wasn't usually assigned to the ER, all available staff had been called to assist with an incoming trauma case. "Multiple vehicle accident on Fifth Avenue, the head nurse announced as staff rushed to their positions. "High-profile patient incoming. Everyone needs to be on their A-game." Sarah quickly donned protective gear and joined the team assembling in the trauma bay. The ambulance doors burst open and paramedics rushed in with their patient on a stretcher. The world seemed to slow down as Sarah recognized the unconscious face beneath the oxygen mask, Hassan Khalil. Her heart skipped a beat, but her training kicked in immediately. This wasn't the imperious businessman from Le Jardin. This was a patient who needed care. She pushed aside her personal feelings and focused on the tasks at hand, assisting the medical team as they worked to stabilize him. Hours passed in a blur of activity. When things finally calmed down, Sarah found herself assigned to monitor Mr. Khalil's vital signs during the night shift. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her as she checked his IV lines and adjusted his monitors. The man who had once wielded such power over her life now lay vulnerable, dependent on the very people he might have once dismissed. Linda appeared at the door, her expression concerned. "Sarah, I just learned about your history with this patient. I can assign someone else if you're uncomfortable." "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm a professional. He's a patient who needs care. Nothing more, nothing less." Linda studied her face for a moment before nodding. "That's exactly the attitude I hoped you'd have. But if anything changes, let me know immediately." As the night progressed, Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, checking vitals, adjusting medications, and ensuring Mr. B. Khalil's comfort despite his unconscious state. She found herself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. Just weeks ago, this man had seemed all-powerful, capable of destroying her career with a single complaint. Now, seeing him in a hospital gown, stripped of his expensive suit and commanding presence, she understood something profound about the equalizing nature of human vulnerability. Dawn was breaking when Mr. Khalil began to stir. Sarah stood by professionally as the doctor conducted his initial consciousness assessment. As awareness returned to his eyes, she saw the moment he recognized her. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something unreadable. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah helped him take small sips through a straw, maintaining her professional composure. "Small sips, Mr. Khalil. Your body needs time to adjust." He studied her face as she worked, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he could speak more clearly, he asked, "You From the restaurant. Yes, Mr. Khalil, I'm now a healthcare assistant at Metropolitan Hospital. Please try to rest and avoid excessive talking. The doctor will be back shortly to discuss your condition. The businessman's eyes followed her as she checked his vital signs and adjusted his pillows. The imperious attitude was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Several times he seemed about to speak, but Sarah maintained a gentle, professional distance, treating him with the same care and respect she showed all her patients. During shift change, Nurse Carter appeared, eyeing the situation with obvious concern. "I'll take over from here," she announced, her tone making it clear she didn't trust Sarah with such a high-profile patient. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, Mr. Khalil's voice stopped her. "Miss Mitchell?" He'd obviously read her name tag. Would you be willing to remain as my primary care assistant?" The request surprised everyone in the room. Nurse Carter's eyebrows shot up, and Sarah herself felt momentarily stunned. She looked to Linda, who had just entered for morning rounds. Linda considered the situation before responding. "If Sarah is willing, and if she feels comfortable with the assignment, we can arrange that." All eyes turned to Sarah, waiting for her response. She thought about the different paths that had led to this moment. Her years of service industry work, the humiliation at Le Jardin, her new beginning at the hospital. Perhaps this was an opportunity to prove something, not to Mr. Khalil, but to herself. "I would be happy to continue caring for Mr. Khalil," she said firmly, "as I would for any patient in need of our help." The subtle emphasis on her words wasn't lost on Mr. Khalil, whose expression reflected a complex mix of emotions. As Sarah left the room to end her shift, she felt a strange sense of peace. The universe had handed her an unexpected opportunity for growth, and she intended to embrace it with grace and professionalism. The following days brought an unusual rhythm to Sarah's work life. Caring for Hassan Khalil proved to be an exercise in patience and professional boundaries. Though he remained polite, an undercurrent of tension lingered in their interactions, like a conversation perpetually waiting to happen. She maintained her focus on his medical needs, carefully documenting his progress and ensuring his comfort, while keeping their interactions strictly professional. One evening, as Sarah checked his vital signs, Mr. Khalil finally broke the silence that had been building between them. "I've been trying to find the right words," he began, his voice carrying none of its former imperial tone. "About that night at Le Jardin?" "Mr. Khalil," Sarah interrupted gently, adjusting his IV line, "that's not necessary. You're here as a patient and that's all that matters." "No," he insisted, sitting up straighter in his bed, "it is necessary. I've had a lot of time to think lying here. My behavior that night was inexcusable. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I was cruel without cause, and I cost you your job." Sarah's hands stilled on the medical chart she was updating. She hadn't expected this conversation, hadn't prepared herself for the vulnerability in his voice. "Thank you for saying that," she replied carefully. "But perhaps everything happens for a reason. I might never have found my way here otherwise." "Here," he repeated thoughtfully, looking around the hospital room. "You seem different here. More confident, more yourself." "I am different here," Sarah acknowledged, allowing herself to relax. "Slightly. In restaurants, the goal was always to be invisible unless needed, to anticipate without being noticed. Here, the work itself has meaning beyond serving others comfort." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Peterson, who came to discuss Mr. Khalil's latest test results. Sarah moved to leave the room, but Mr. Khalil asked her to stay. As the doctor explained the findings, Sarah noticed Mr. Khalil's subtle expressions of anxiety, something she'd become attuned to in her weeks of patient care. "The accident caused significant trauma," Dr. Peterson explained, "but you're recovering well. However, there are some concerning patterns in your stress indicators. Have you been experiencing anxiety or unusual levels of stress?" Mr. Khalil's face remained impassive, but Sarah noticed his hands gripping the bedsheet tightly. "I'm fine," he stated flatly, "just focused on getting back to work." After the doctor left, Sarah busied herself checking the equipment, giving Mr. Khalil time to process the information. Finally, she spoke. You know, Mrs. Thompson, one of my other patients, always says that hospitals are places where we leave our masks at the door. Even the strongest people need support sometimes. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. The accident, it wasn't random. Someone tampered with my car's brakes. The police investigation is ongoing, but... He trailed off, his composed facade cracking slightly. Sarah felt her professional distance wavering in the face of his obvious distress. "That must be terrifying," she said softly. "Feeling unsafe in your own life." "I've made many enemies in business," he admitted. "But I never thought... I always believed power was the ultimate protection. Now I'm not so sure of anything." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several business associates, their expensive suits and aggressive energy feeling out of place in the calm hospital environment. Sarah excused herself, but as she left, she noticed how Mr. Khalil's expression changed, his vulnerability disappearing behind a mask of corporate confidence. Later that evening, while helping him prepare for sleep, Mr. Khalil spoke again. "Your patients, the ones you mentioned, do they ever talk about feeling lost?" "All the time," Sarah replied, adjusting his pillows. "Mrs. Thompson says the hardest part of healing isn't the physical pain, it's accepting that we're not the same person we were before. But she also says that sometimes that's a gift." "A gift," he repeated skeptically. "I've spent my entire life building walls, Miss Mitchell. Success requires it, or at least I thought it did. Walls can protect us," Sarah acknowledged, "but they can also isolate us. In my experience, both in restaurants and here, sometimes the strongest people are those who know when to let their walls down." Their eyes met, and for a moment, all the pretenses, patient and caregiver, former employer and employee, powerful and powerless, seemed to fall away. They were just two people, each carrying their own burdens, each learning to navigate a world that had shifted beneath their feet. The moment was broken by Nurse Carter's arrival for the evening medication round. As Sarah prepared to end her shift, Mr. Khalil called out, "Miss Mitchell, thank you, not just for the care, but for seeing me, the real me." Sarah smiled softly. "That's what we do here, Mr. Khalil. We see people as they are, not as they pretend to be. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day of healing." The Metropolitan Hospital's board meeting room buzzed with tension as Linda Martinez delivered the news that would change everything. "Our funding has been cut by 30%, she announced to the assembled staff. "Without immediate intervention, we'll have to reduce services significantly." Sarah sat in the back of the room, her heart sinking. She thought about Mrs. Thompson and the other patients who relied on the hospital's care. The elderly woman had just started walking again, her progress fueled by the daily therapy sessions that might now be at risk. After the meeting, the hospital corridors felt heavier, weighted down by worry. Staff members huddled in small groups, discussing the implications in hushed tones. Sarah continued her rounds, trying to maintain a positive demeanor for her patients, while her mind raced with concerns about their future care. When she entered Mr. Khalil's room for his evening checkup, she found him sitting up in bed working on a laptop, despite doctor's orders to rest. He looked up as she entered, immediately noting her troubled expression. "Something's wrong," he stated, not a question, but an observation. Sarah hesitated, unsure about sharing hospital business with a patient, but something in his expression, the genuine concern she'd come to recognize over the past weeks, made her speak. "The hospital is facing some financial difficulties. Budget cuts. It might affect patient care." Mr. Khalil's fingers stilled on his keyboard. "Tell me more." As Sarah explained the situation, she watched his expression change from concern to contemplation. The businessman she'd first met at Le Jardin would have dismissed such problems as beneath his notice. But the man before her now listened intently, asking detailed questions about the hospital's needs and current funding structure. "I might be able to help," he said finally. "My foundation has been looking for meaningful investment opportunities in healthcare." Sarah's heart leaped, but experience had taught her to be cautious. "Mr. Khalil, while that's incredibly generous, I didn't tell you this to solicit donations." "I know you didn't," he replied with a slight smile. "And it's not a donation I'm proposing, it's an investment in the community. Would you be willing to arrange a meeting with the hospital board?" Before Sarah could respond, Nurse Carter entered the room. The veteran nurse had maintained her skepticism about Sarah's assignment to Mr. Khalil's care, often finding reasons to check on them during their interactions. "Mr. Khalil needs his rest," she announced pointedly. "And Sarah, there's a situation with Mrs. Thompson that requires your attention." In Mrs. Thompson's room, Sarah found the elderly woman in tears. The news about the budget cuts had spread quickly among the patients. "They're saying physical therapy services might be reduced," Mrs. Thompson said, clutching Sarah's hand. "How am I supposed to get better without my sessions?" "We'll figure something out," Sarah assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at her heart. "The hospital administration is working on solutions." Later that evening, as Sarah finished her shift, she found Linda waiting for her by the nurses' station. "Mr. Khalil's team contacted the board," she said, her expression unreadable. "They've requested a meeting tomorrow to discuss potential investment opportunities." "That's wonderful news, isn't it?" Sarah asked, noting Linda's hesitation. "It could be," Linda replied carefully, "but the board has concerns. Some members worry about giving too much control to private investors, especially someone with Mr. Khalil's reputation." Sarah understood their hesitation. She'd seen firsthand how wealth and power could corrupt, how it could turn people into characters rather than human beings. But she'd also witnessed Mr. Khalil's transformation, the way vulnerability and human connection had cracked his carefully constructed facade. "He's different now," Sarah found herself saying. "The accident, his time here, it's changed him." Linda studied her thoughtfully. "The board has requested your presence at tomorrow's meeting. They want to hear your perspective, given your unique history with Mr. Khalil. Are you comfortable with that?" The request caught Sarah off guard. She'd come to the hospital seeking a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life away from the power dynamics of her previous career. Now she found herself potentially playing a crucial role in the hospital's future. "I'll be there," she said firmly. "These patients, this hospital, they've given me a second chance. If I can help secure their future, I want to do it." As she left the hospital that night, Sarah reflected on the strange turns life could take. 6 weeks ago, she'd stood outside Le Jardin, feeling like her world had ended. Now she stood outside Metropolitan Hospital, preparing to help shape its future. The city lights sparkled above her, but this time they didn't feel indifferent to her fate. They felt like stars guiding her path, showing her that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most unexpected opportunities. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror the next morning, adjusting the collar of her only business suit, a navy ensemble she'd worn to countless job interviews. The familiar fabric felt strange after weeks in hospital scrubs, like putting on a costume from a previous life. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her mother's pearl necklace, a gesture of seeking strength from family ties. The hospital boardroom looked different in daylight, more imposing with its oak-paneled walls and portraits of past medical directors watching from above. Board members filed in, their expressions guarded as they took their seats around the massive conference table. Sarah noticed Linda offering her an encouraging smile from across the room. Hassan Khalil arrived last, walking slowly but steadily, insisted on attending in person despite still being a patient. He'd traded his hospital gown for an impeccably tailored suit, though Sarah noticed he leaned heavily on a cane. Their eyes met briefly as he took his seat, and she saw determination in his gaze. "Let's begin, Dr. Richardson," the board chairman announced. "Mr. Khalil, we understand you have a proposal for our hospital." Khalil nodded, his voice strong despite his weakened physical state. "Metropolitan Hospital serves this community with distinction, providing care to those who need it most. My foundation proposes a substantial investment to not only address the current budget shortfall, but to expand services and modernize facilities." The presentation that followed was comprehensive, with Khalil's team outlining plans for new equipment, expanded programs, and enhanced staff training. Sarah watched the board members' expressions shift from skepticism to interest as numbers and projections filled the screens. "This all sounds impressive," Dr. Richardson said carefully, "but we have concerns about maintaining the hospital's independence and mission. Your reputation in the business world, Mr. Khalil, is aggressive." That's why I've requested Miss Mitchell's presence today, Khalil replied, surprising everyone in the room. She has a unique perspective on both who I was and who I've become. All eyes turned to Sarah. She felt her heart racing but drew strength from her weeks of handling critical situations on the hospital floor. When I first met Mr. Khalil at Le Jardin, she began, her voice steady, he represented everything I thought was wrong with power and privilege. But here at Metropolitan, I've watched him experience what we see every day, the equalizing nature of human vulnerability, the importance of compassion over control, she continued, warming to her subject. This hospital gave me a second chance, when I needed it most. Through caring for patients like Mrs. Thompson, who's regaining her independence through our physical therapy program, and even Mr. Khalil himself, I've learned that true strength lies in our capacity to help others. I believe Mr. Khalil has learned the same lesson. The room fell silent as she finished speaking. Nurse Carter, who sat among the staff representatives, looked at Sarah with newfound respect. Pretty words, one board member commented, but business is business. How can we be sure this investment won't lead to unwanted changes in our operations? Because the investment will be structured as a charitable trust, Khalil announced. With oversight from a board that includes hospital staff representatives, I'm not looking to take over Metropolitan. I'm looking to give back to the institution that showed me what real value means. The discussion continued for hours, delving into details of funding structures and organizational safeguards. Sarah observed the proceedings with growing hope, watching as initial resistance gave way to cautious optimism. During a brief recess, Sarah found herself alone with Khalil in the hospital corridor. He looked tired, the strain of the meeting evident in his posture. "You should be resting," she said, professional concern overtaking business formality. "Some things are worth the effort," he replied. Then, more quietly, "Thank you for what you said in there, for seeing the change in me." "I meant every word," Sarah responded. "Though I have to admit, I never imagined we'd be here when I first served you that lukewarm dinner." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Life has a way of serving its own lessons, doesn't it? Speaking of which—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The Foundation's healthcare initiative will need someone to oversee its community outreach programs, someone who understands both the human and practical sides of healthcare. Would you be interested?" The offer caught Sarah completely off guard. "Me, but I'm just a healthcare assistant." "You're far more than that," he countered. "You're someone who transformed a moment of injustice into an opportunity to help others. The Foundation needs exactly that kind of perspective." Before Sarah could respond, they were called back into the meeting. But as she returned to her seat, her mind raced with possibilities. 6 weeks ago, she'd thought her career was over. Now she faced a future full of potential, one where she could help shape healthcare delivery on a larger scale. The news of the board's decision to accept Khalil's investment spread through Metropolitan Hospital like wildfire, bringing with it a wave of hope and anticipation. Sarah found herself at the center of attention, with staff members constantly approaching her for details about the future plans. Even Nurse Carter had softened her stance, occasionally offering small smiles of acknowledgement in the hallways. "You've become quite the hospital celebrity," Mrs. Thompson teased during her morning checkup. The elderly woman was making remarkable progress, her determination matching the renewed energy that seemed to pulse through the hospital's corridors. "I'm just doing my job," Sarah replied, helping Mrs. Thompson with her walking exercises. "Besides, you're the real star here. Look at you, practically racing down the hallway now. Thanks to you and this wonderful place," Mrs. Thompson said, pausing to catch her breath. "I heard about the job offer from Mr. Khalil's foundation. Will you take it?" Sarah's hands stilled on the walker. The question had been spinning in her mind for days. "I haven't decided yet. It's an amazing opportunity, but you're afraid of leaving all this behind," Mrs. Thompson finished for her. "Afraid of stepping back into that world of power and money that hurt you before." Before Sarah could respond, Linda appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, could you join me in my office when you're finished here? There's something we need to discuss." In Linda's office, Sarah found not only the nursing supervisor, but also Dr. Richardson and, surprisingly, Nurse Carter. Their expressions were serious, causing Sarah's heart to skip a beat. "We've received some concerning information," Dr. Richardson began, his voice grave. "It seems there's been an attempt to access Mr. Khalil's medical records through unauthorized channels. Given your unique position and history with him, we need to ensure there's no conflict of interest." Sarah felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this?" "Not at all," Linda interjected quickly. "But as his primary care provider, and now potentially his foundation's employee, we need to be absolutely certain about maintaining professional boundaries." "I would never compromise patient confidentiality," Sarah stated firmly, her voice trembling, slightly with emotion. "Everything I've done here has been about protecting and helping our patients, including Mr. Khalil." To her surprise, Nurse Carter spoke up. "I can vouch for that. I've watched Sarah like a hawk since she started caring for Mr. Khalil, looking for any sign of impropriety. What I've seen instead is someone who consistently puts patient care above everything else." The support from her former critic brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. Dr. Richardson's expression softened. "We believe you, Sarah, but this situation highlights the complexities you'll face if you accept the foundation position. The line between personal history and professional responsibility will often blur." "I understand that," Sarah replied, wiping her eyes. "But maybe that's exactly why I'm the right person for the job. I've lived both sides of this equation now. I understand the world of service and the world of healthcare. I know how it feels to be powerless, and I know the responsibility that comes with having power." Linda smiled. "That's precisely why Mr. Khalil wants you for this position. But remember, whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here at Metropolitan." Later that evening, as Sarah made her final rounds, she found Mr. Khalil sitting up in his bed, reviewing documents. He looked up as she entered, immediately, noticing her troubled expression. "I heard about the records breach attempt," he said quietly. "My security team is investigating. Sarah, I want you to know that I never doubted your integrity." "Thank you," she replied, checking his vital signs with practiced efficiency. "It means a lot to hear that. Mr. Khalil, about the foundation position." "Hassan," he interrupted. "After everything, I think you can call me Hassan." Sarah paused, the familiar gesture catching her off guard. "Hassan, I need to know something." "Why me?" "Really, there must be hundreds of more qualified candidates." He set aside his papers, considering her question carefully. "Because you showed me something I'd forgotten existed, the power of genuine care. When I arrived here, I was broken in more ways than one. I'd spent years building an empire based on power and control, never realizing how empty it all was. You and this hospital showed me a different kind of strength." His words resonated with something deep inside her, a truth she'd been discovering about herself over these past weeks. The Sarah who'd stood trembling in Le Jardin's kitchen, humiliated and afraid, had transformed into someone stronger, someone who understood that true power came from the ability to help others. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Sarah arrived for her shift, her mind still processing the events of the previous day. The attempted breach of Hassan's medical records had created an undercurrent of tension throughout the hospital, with security measures being tightened and staff scrutiny increased. As she approached Hassan's room, she heard raised voices. A group of men in expensive suits, his business associates, were engaged in a heated discussion with him. Sarah hesitated at the door, not wanting to interrupt, but Hassan caught sight of her and gestured for her to enter. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this discussion later," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. The men filed out, casting curious glances at Sarah as they passed. "Is everything all right?" she asked, beginning her routine check of his vital signs. Hassan's expression was troubled. "My security team has made some discoveries about the accident. It seems the person who tried to access my medical records is connected to one of my former business partners, James Sterling. He's been quietly buying up shares in my company while I've been hospitalized." Sarah's hand stilled on the blood pressure cuff. "You think he's behind everything?" "The evidence points that way. He's always resented my success, but I never thought—" Hassan trailed off, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "The world I've built, the power I've accumulated, it's made me a target." Before Sarah could respond, Linda appeared at the door. "Sarah, there's a situation with Mrs. Thompson that needs your attention immediately." She found Mrs. Thompson in obvious distress, but not from physical pain. "They're saying the physical therapy department might still face cuts," the elderly woman explained, clutching Sarah's hand. "Even with Mr. Khalil's investment, there's talk about restructuring and efficiency measures." Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd been so focused on the broad strokes of the hospital's future that she'd missed the details being discussed in board meetings. "Who told you this?" One of the board members was discussing it in the hallway with his assistant. Something about how certain programs aren't cost-effective enough. The news hit Sarah hard. This was exactly the kind of corporate thinking she'd hoped Hassan's investment would prevent. Making her way back to his room, she found him reviewing documents on his laptop. "We need to talk about the Foundation's plans for the hospital," she said without preamble. "Are you really planning to cut physical therapy services?" Hassan looked genuinely surprised. "No, absolutely not. Where did you hear that?" Sarah explained what Mrs. Thompson had overheard. Hassan's expression darkened. "It seems Sterling's influence reaches further than I thought. He must have allies on the hospital board." "What do you mean?" "Sterling's specialty is hostile takeovers. He finds vulnerable institutions, creates internal chaos, then presents himself as the solution. He's trying to undermine my investment in the hospital to force me into a corner." Hassan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I've been so focused on protecting my company that I didn't see the bigger picture." Sarah felt her world tilting again. The safe haven she'd found at Metropolitan, the future she'd begun to envision with the Foundation, it was all at risk of becoming collateral damage in a corporate power play. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice firm with determination. Hassan studied her for a moment. "We need to present a united front. The board meeting next week, it's not just about finalizing the investment anymore. It's about protecting everything this hospital stands for." "Then we'll need allies," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Mrs. Thompson isn't the only patient who's worried, and there are staff members who've devoted their lives to this place." "You're thinking like a community organizer," Hassan observed with a slight smile. "A far cry from the server I met at Le Jardin." "That server knew how to read a room and anticipate needs," Sarah replied. "These skills just have a different purpose now." As if on cue, Nurse Carter appeared in the doorway. She hesitated before speaking. "I couldn't help overhearing. For what it's worth, you have more allies than you might think. The entire nursing staff is behind you. We've seen too many good hospitals turn into profit machines. We won't let that happen here." The support from her former critic gave Sarah a surge of hope. She looked at Hassan, seeing in his eyes the same determination she felt. They had 1 week to save not just the hospital's future, but the very soul of what healthcare should be. As she left Hassan's room that evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. Not everyone. That Metropolitan is who they seem to be." The message sent a chill down her spine, but it also strengthened her resolve. She'd found her purpose in these hospital halls, and she wasn't about to let anyone destroy that. The week before the crucial board meeting passed in a blur of activity. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement within Metropolitan Hospital. What had started as quiet conversations in break rooms had evolved into organized action. Staff members from every department came forward with stories and data supporting the importance of maintaining comprehensive patient care. Mrs. Thompson had become an unexpected rallying point. Her recovery journey, documented meticulously by the physical therapy department, provided compelling evidence of the program's value. Other patients began sharing their stories too, creating a powerful narrative about the hospital's impact on the community. "You've started quite the revolution," Hassan commented one evening, watching from his window as staff members gathered in the courtyard for an impromptu meeting. His condition had improved enough for short walks, though he still tired easily. "They started it themselves," Sarah replied, adjusting his medication drip. "I just helped them find their voice." "Don't underestimate what you've done here," he said seriously. "Leaders don't create movements, They recognize the power that's already there and help direct it toward positive change. Their conversation was interrupted by Linda rushing into the room, her face pale. "Sarah, Hassan, you need to see this." She handed them her tablet, displaying an email that had been circulated to the board members. It contained detailed allegations about financial irregularities in Hassan's companies and questioned his fitness to be involved with the hospital. "Sterling," Hassan muttered, his face darkening. "He's trying to poison the well before the board meeting." "But these numbers," Sarah said, scanning the document, "they don't match anything in the Foundation's proposal." "They're manipulated," Hassan confirmed. "But by the time we prove that, the damage will be done. Sterling knows how to play this game, create doubt, foster division, then sweep in with a rescue plan." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Then we need to change the game. This isn't about corporate politics anymore, it's about people's lives." A knock at the door revealed Nurse Carter and Dr. Richardson. "We've all seen the email," Dr. Richardson said without preamble. "The board is calling an emergency session tonight." "How many board members do you think Sterling has influenced?" Sarah asked. "At least 3, Dr. Richardson replied grimly. "Maybe more. They are pushing for an immediate vote on the investment proposal." "Then we need to show them what's really at stake," Sarah said, an idea forming in her mind. She turned to Linda. "Can you gather as many staff members as possible in the main conference room? And Mrs. Thompson, would she be willing to speak?" "About that," Nurse Carter interjected, "Mrs. Thompson was just transferred to another hospital. The paperwork says it was her request, but when I tried to confirm with her family, they knew nothing about it." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Sterling," she whispered, "he's trying to silence our strongest advocate." Hassan struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "No, he's made a mistake. By targeting a patient, he's crossed a line." "Sarah, do you still have those text messages warning you about trust?" Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone. "My security team traced them," Hassan continued. "They came from inside Sterling's organization. It seems not everyone agrees with his methods. We just need to prove the connection between him and Mrs. Thompson's transfer." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Staff members combed through records while Hassan's security team worked their contacts. Sarah coordinated everything from Hassan's room, which had become an impromptu command center. As evening fell, Linda returned with crucial information. "We found something. The transfer order for Mrs. Thompson was processed through a medical transport company owned by a subsidiary of Sterling's corporation, the same company that's been quietly buying up medical service providers across the city. It's not just about Metropolitan," Sarah realized. "Sterling's trying to build a healthcare empire, turning patients into profit centers." "The board meeting starts in an hour," Dr. Richardson announced. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Sarah looked around the room at the unlikely allies who had come together. Hospital staff, security experts, administrators, and a reformed business tycoon. Each had a piece of the puzzle, but bringing it all together would require something more. "I have an idea," she said finally, "but it's risky. We need to let Sterling think he's won, right up until the moment we show everyone exactly who he is." Hassan studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "I trust you, Sarah. Whatever you need, you have my complete support." As they finalized their plans, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The next hour would determine not just the future of Metropolitan Hospital, but the very nature of healthcare in their community. The server who had once been humiliated at Le Jardin was about to take on one of the most powerful men in the city, armed with nothing but truth and the support of people who believed in something bigger than profit. The Metropolitan Hospital. Boardroom had never felt more crowded. Board members sat around the massive oak table, while staff members lined the walls, their presence a silent statement of solidarity. James Sterling sat near the head of the table, his expensive suit and confident smile a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Sarah stood by the door, her heart pounding but her expression calm. Hassan sat nearby, looking pale but determined. They exchanged a quick glance, a silent confirmation that everything was in place. "Let's begin," Dr. Richardson announced, his voice grave. We are here to address concerns raised about Mr. Khalil's investment proposal and to vote on an alternative. Funding offer from Sterling Healthcare Solutions. Sterling leaned forward, his smile widening. Given the serious questions about Mr. Khalil's financial stability and the irregularities in his proposal, I believe the responsible choice is clear. Sterling Healthcare has a proven track record of turning struggling hospitals into profitable institutions. Profitable for whom? The question came from Sarah, who stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. Miss Mitchell, Sterling said smoothly, while your dedication to the hospital is admirable, this is a matter for the board to decide. Actually, Sarah replied, her voice steady, this is a matter for everyone to decide. Because what's at stake here isn't just money, it's the very soul of healthcare. She nodded to Linda, who dimmed the lights. A projection screen descended from the ceiling, and Sarah began her presentation. Over the past week, we've uncovered some interesting connections, she continued. First, let's look at what happened to other hospitals after Sterling Healthcare took control. The screen filled with data showing reduced services, increased patient costs, and declining care quality at facilities under Sterling's management. Sterling's smile faded slightly. These numbers are taken out of context. Context is exactly what we're providing, Sarah interrupted, changing the slide. Like the context of Mrs. Thompson's mysterious transfer, ordered through a medical transport company owned by your corporation, or the context of the manufactured financial irregularities in Mr. Khalil's records, traced back to one of your subsidiaries. The room erupted in murmurs. Sterling stood, his facade cracking. These are baseless accusations. Nothing here is baseless, Hassan spoke up, rising slowly from his chair. Every document, every connection, every piece of evidence has been verified by multiple sources, including members of your own organization who couldn't stomach your methods anymore. The door opened, and Mrs. Thompson entered in a wheelchair, pushed by Nurse Carter. I believe I have something to say about patient care under Mr. Sterling's management, the elderly woman announced, her voice strong despite her obvious fatigue. For the next hour, the truth unfolded in irrefutable detail. Staff members presented data showing the real impact of Metropolitan's comprehensive care approach. Patients testified about their experiences. Hassan's security team revealed the full extent of Sterling's attempted corporate takeover. Sterling's composed exterior crumbled as his plans unraveled. When he tried to leave, he found his path blocked by hospital security. The police would like to ask you some questions about corporate fraud and patient endangerment, Dr. Richardson informed him coldly. As Sterling was escorted out, the boardroom erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as Mrs. Thompson gripped her hand. You did it, dear, the elderly woman whispered. You saved our hospital. We all did it, Sarah replied, looking around at the faces of her colleagues. No longer just co-workers, but partners in something meaningful. The board's vote was unanimous. Hassan's investment proposal was accepted, with additional provisions for staff oversight and community involvement. But the real victory went beyond the formal decision. Later that evening, as the excitement died down, Sarah found herself back in Hassan's hospital room, helping him settle in after the long day. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I first met you at Le Jardin, I thought power meant being able to control others. You've shown me that real power comes from enabling others to reach their full potential. Sarah smiled, adjusting his pillows. And you've shown me that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead us exactly where we need to be. Speaking of which, Hassan continued, that foundation position is still open, but I'm thinking we need to expand the role. How do you feel about heading up a new division focused on community healthcare advocacy? Sarah's heart swelled with possibility. I think I'd like that very much. As long as I can still keep my hands in direct patient care sometimes, it helps keep perspective on what really matters. I wouldn't have it any other way, Hassan replied with a warm smile. 3 months later, Sarah stood at a podium in Metropolitan's newly renovated community hall, addressing a packed audience of healthcare workers, community members, and media representatives. The hospital's transformation had become a model for others across the country, proving that quality care and financial stability could coexist. Mrs. Thompson sat in the front row, now walking with just a cane, her recovery a testament to the power of comprehensive care. Nurse Carter stood nearby, her initial skepticism long transformed into steadfast support. Hassan, fully recovered, watched from the sidelines as Sarah shared their vision for the future of healthcare. Looking out at the faces before her, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a struggling server to a healthcare advocate, from powerlessness to purpose, she had found her calling not in serving the wealthy, but in serving humanity. In healthcare, as in life, she concluded her speech, our strength lies not in our individual power, but in our collective commitment to caring for each other. Every patient who walks through our doors isn't just a case to be treated, they're a reminder of why we chose this path. At Metropolitan, we don't just treat illness, we nurture hope, dignity, and the human spirit. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words. It was for every person who had fought to preserve something precious, for every patient who had trusted them with their care, for every staff member who had chosen purpose over profit. It was the sound of community, of healing, of hope. And somewhere in that sound, Sarah could hear the faint echo of a door closing at Le Jardin and the louder rhythm of countless doors opening at Metropolitan, welcoming all who needed care, comfort, and compassion. The end. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's journey from adversity to triumph has touched your hearts. Her story reminds us that sometimes life's greatest setbacks can lead to our most meaningful victories. To continue experiencing powerful stories of transformation and hope, please subscribe to our channel and click the like button below. We've prepared a special playlist of similarly inspiring narratives that you can find by clicking to your left. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment of adversity that led to unexpected positive change? Your story could inspire others on their own journey of transformation. Join our community of storytellers and hope seekers, where every ending is just a new beginning waiting to unfold.